So our next step is number 7, about travel. We're going to do something called pleating, and we want to travel across the surface of the quilt. So a pleat is where we fold our fabric and sew a running stitch right across the fold. When we unfold it, it's going to look like it was pieced, but it wasn't pieced, it was just pleated. The prompt says that the pleat should travel from one side of the quilt to any other side of the quilt. But as I've been thinking about it, and especially during these times when we can't travel very much, I think just any kind of a pleat would be fine. So for example, if I wanted to pleat a circle here, I could have that shape floating. I could also pleat something that comes in from one side and exits that same side. So you can do any of those variations. I'm about to get started on my pleat for this quilt. So I'm actually going to follow the rules and travel from the top corner down to the side of the quilt. And I'm going to go for a curve that's actually a bit breast-like because that's the part of my body that I was tracing here. I'm going to map out my curve using applique pins. You can see that they are nice and short compared to a standard quilting pin, and they're going to make it easy for me to lay down a guide, and I might even choose to lay down a piece of thread itself first so that I can see, before I commit to it, the curve that I want to follow, make sure that I like how that looks and what it does in the quilt. And from there, I can trace along my string with my applique pins so that I'm mapping out my curve. And you'll notice that with this technique, I'm not using any chalk or fabric marker or anything that will need to be taken out later. So here I can remove my thread, and I can see with my applique pins that I've mapped out the line that I would like to pleat. So now, with the thread on my needle, I'll make my quilter's knot, same as always, and I'm going to pleat this. I can do a pleat where the edge is under. I could also do something called a pin tuck where I'm lifting it up and creating a raised edge. And we can just think a little bit if I like the idea of something raised versus if I like it lower. I've actually never done the pin tuck variation on a quilt before, and because this is such a small line, I think that could be actually a really nice thing. So I'm going to do more of a pin tuck, more of a pin tuck than a pleat for this with my red thread. I want to just sew through one layer, so I'm not going to be sewing through the background, that backing, more than I need to. I'll take my pins out as I go. And so for this, I'm just lifting up, and I want to sew into as small an area as possible. And I also want to use a nice small stitch. But you can see that I am biting into the edge of my fabric a very small amount. By doing that in such a small amount, you're able to create almost any line. It could be a very big, long, meandering, zigzagging line traveling across the surface of your quilt if you keep that a nice, small, I would say that's smaller than even 1/8 of an inch. It might be a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance that I'm doing. And that's fine because I'm not cutting into the fabric, so nothing is going to rip away on me with that. And so as I take out each pin, I'm able to pinch the fabric between my fingers, roll it slightly, and get a nice smooth curve. And I could be using my thimble and gripper right now, but it's also okay to be without it. In general, though, you do want to be very careful that you're using things that will protect your fingers as you're sewing. So here, because I don't have to pull that out quite so early, you can see that I'm able to follow right along the edge, just moving back and forth with my needle, pulling through. And this is the most dramatic part of the curve that I'm doing. So here you can see I'm finding that curve between my pins, pinching in my fingers, and then I'm able to keep that nice, smooth, round curve. I can curve anywhere I want so long as I keep that nice, tiny 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. And here I'm able to go off the edge. I've completed the whole step for you. So just going right there to my edge, and I'm going to make sure that I'm giving a nice little tug, smoothing that, making sure it's not gathering or taking up more thread than it needs to. I'll finish that off with my usual tailor's knot. And here you can see this variation is the pin tuck variation because you can see the thread raised. If it were my pleat, which is the more standard way, it's what I've done in the past, what I usually do, you can see it just looks like any other seam. This is a real seam, and this is my pleated seam. And especially with that bright red, you can see that there's a beautiful little bit of color peeking out right there. So it could be this side up, or it could be this side up, and that's just kind of an unique and opposite choice for me to go for that raised seam here. Two variations of this quilt side by side, and as we look carefully a little closer now, my traveling section is right here. You can see how nice that's raised. As we look at the other variation, we can see that it begins here and travels across the quilt, moving along here, and then over onto the shinier fabric. And so you're able to see the way that that's moving across the surface of the quilt. It's a very subtle thing, and it's a great way to add texture in a quilt. So a subtle extra area of variation and interest. This is a quilt that I finished a couple days ago, and it is made mostly with just pleating. You can see that it's all one type of fabric, so a lot of the visual interest in the quilt is the quilting itself, the knots that you can see on the surface of the quilt, as well as the density of my quilting. And so you can see some areas are more dense, others less so. There's one seam, because my fabric wasn't 5 feet wide across, so this is a real seam where I joined 2 pieces of fabric, but all of the other seams in the quilt were pleated. So even this circle right here, I pinched in just like I showed you guys earlier, and that's how I made that shape in the quilt. I was also able to get this nice L shape seam. That's something you wouldn't normally create in a regular quilt. You can see it lays quite nicely right there. There's several lines here. 1, 2, 3. You can see them. 1, 2, 3 coming across. 4th there. So anyways, that's just another interesting example of being able to see some pleating. This is another favorite pleated quilt of mine. So you can see that there are some big color blocks that were sewn together, and it's a lot of hand-dyed fabric, not all hand-dyed fabric. So this square, you can see it's one solid piece of fabric. But if we move over here, it's the same fabric, but it appears to be many small pieces. So you can see all of that piecing. But because it's just one piece of fabric, what I did is I pleated strips, and these are pieced with the sewing machine. So I pleated strips, and then I chopped them up and then made a long strip, and so my final sewing was sewing this long strip to this one, to this one, to this one. But these guys were first pleated and then chopped up and redistributed to create some more interesting texture. A bit like an area of water and then an area with a wave or a ripple in it, if this is a quilt of a beach. Here is another area with pleating. So this is one solid piece of fabric dyed with turmeric, and this is the undyed fabric, that same fabric I told you about before from Joann's. And these are not cut seams, these are just pleats, but they add a really beautiful reward and level of interest for someone who's looking closely at the quilt. Another final area, and this was done partly for practical reasons. You can see with a sewing machine, this would be a difficult intersection to piece. And so part of this is hand pieced just to get around it, but then to make it not look like an awkward little bit, I created these lines of pleating here so that it would feel a bit more purposeful instead of a solution for an awkward thing that happened. So just a little bit behind this technique. It really goes over well when I teach workshops, both with machine piecing and hand piecing. And so that was step number 7, called travel. This is week 5. It is another 2-step week, so stay tuned for step 8, where I get into manifestation.